The Petty War Begins Karen Whitmore was not just a neighbor. She was a force of nature, or at least she thought she was. The kind of person who saw herself as the self-appointed queen of her domain. She was the president of the Oak Ridge Estates. HOA, a title she wore like a royal crown, and she thrived on control the way a shark thrives in blood-filled water. She did not simply enforce rules. She invented them. And when there were no more rules to enforce, she would dig into her bottomless pit of imagination and create new ones, just so she could have something to wield over people's heads. I should have known she was going to be trouble the first time. I met her. It was at a community barbecue a month after I moved in. She floated across the lawn in a pressed cream suit, her hair so stiff from hairspray that a tornado could not have shifted it. Her smile was flawless, too flawless. I remember thinking it was the kind of smile you'd see from a used car salesman about to hand you the keys to a lemon. We shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and within 3 minutes she was casually probing me about what landscaping plans I had for my front yard, whether I owned pets, and how I intended to keep my property in harmony with the community's aesthetics. I told her, politely, that my property was not part of Oak Ridge Estates and therefore not bound to the HOA's guidelines. That was the moment her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, just a flicker, but I caught it. It was the look of someone who had just been told no and did not hear that word very often. I thought nothing of it at the time. I had no idea that single polite refusal would mark me as a target. The first sign came 2 weeks later. I was sipping coffee on my porch when I found a letter in my mailbox. The envelope was crisp, heavy, and embossed with the Oak Ridge HOA logo, in shiny gold foil, as though it were some royal decree. Inside, in overly formal language, was a notice addressed to Dear Homeowner, informing me that I was required to register my property with Oak Ridge HOA and comply with all community guidelines, including monthly dues, landscaping standards, and aesthetic compliance inspections. Required? I almost choked on my coffee. The only reason I had chosen this property in the first place was because it sat just outside the HOA boundary. My home was my sanctuary, my rules, my space, my peace. And yet, here was Karen, pretending I was somehow under her jurisdiction. Laughed, shook my head, and tossed the letter in the trash. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time, it was a fine, $250 for failure to maintain property aesthetics. I stepped outside and looked at my yard, freshly mowed grass, shrubs neatly trimmed, driveway clean. My truck parked squarely in the designated space. There was nothing out of place. It was pure nonsense. I ignored it. By the end of the week, my mailbox was stuffed with violation notices. $100 for unauthorized exterior modifications. Nothing had been modified. $150 for excessive noise disturbances. I worked late shifts and was barely home. $200 for failure to submit a landscaping plan. I didn't even know that was a thing. It was obvious what she was doing. She was testing me, seeing if I'd get nervous and just pay up. Some people might have, but I am not some people. I threw every notice in the trash. That's when Karine escalated. One morning, I walked out to find her standing in my driveway like she owned the place. Clipboard in hand, pen poised, sunglasses reflecting my front door. She didn't even look away when I stepped outside. She wanted me to see her. She wanted me to know she was there. I walked over slowly, coffee mug in hand. Something you need, Karen? She glanced at her gold wristwatch as if I had kept her waiting. Oh good, I was hoping to catch you. Her voice was syrupy, the kind of tone you use when you're trying to sound sweet, but it's laced with condescension. She flipped through the papers on her clipboard, plucked one out, and held it up like it was a court summons. I just wanted to personally remind you about the outstanding violations on your property. I noticed you haven't submitted any payments yet. I barely looked at the paper. Karen, I'm not part of your HOA. Her smile didn't waver. "Well, Oak Ridge Estates has certain expectations for the surrounding properties. It's only fair that everyone contributes." "Fair?" I laughed. "Let me make this real clear. I don't answer to you. Stop stuffing my mailbox with this nonsense because it's going straight in the trash." For a fraction of a second, her perfect mask slipped. Her jaw tightened. Her grip on the clipboard turned white-knuckled. Then, just as quickly, it was back. "Well," she said with a fake smile, "I do hope you reconsider." "You wouldn't. Want to make things difficult for yourself?" I tilted my head. "Is that a threat?" She gave a breathy laugh. "Oh, not at all. Just a friendly reminder that this community values cooperation." I stepped closer so that the space between us was barely a foot. My voice dropped. "Here's a reminder for you, Karen. If I find one more fake violation notice in my mailbox, I'll be filing a harassment complaint. You can play queen of the HOA all you want, but you have no authority over me." Her lips twitched, but she said nothing. She spun on her heel and walked back down my driveway, heels clicking against the concrete like gunshots. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, I woke up to find a pile of garbage dumped on my front lawn. Bags ripped open, trash spilling across the grass. A week later, my mailbox was knocked over. After that, I started hearing whispers, neighbors looking away when I passed, muttering to each other. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Until I ran into Jim at the gas station. Jim was an old-timer. The kind of man who had lived in the area for decades, knew every crack in the sidewalks and every rumor that passed through. He filled up his truck and gave me a sympathetic look. "Hope you get things sorted out soon." I frowned. "Sorted out?" Jim sighed. "Karen's been telling people you've got legal trouble. Says you're one of those problem homeowners who refuses to cooperate. Even mentioned something about a warrant." I blinked. "A warrant?" He nodded. "You know how she is. HOA politics." No, this wasn't politics. This was war. The very next morning, I got a letter marked final notice from the Oak Ridge HOA Legal Department. Inside was an official statement. Failure to comply with HOA policies will result in legal action. Please be advised that a warrant has been issued for your continued refusal to adhere to community guidelines. I stared at the page. Then I laughed. Not just a chuckle, a deep, genuine laugh. She had actually put the word warrant on paper. She actually thought she could scare me into compliance. Karen didn't know who she was dealing with. I'm not just some random homeowner. I'm a U.S. Marshal. I've dealt with cartel enforcers, violent fugitives, and organized crime. And now Karen, the self-appointed queen of a neighborhood, HOA, thought she could intimidate me with a fake warrant? I could have shut it down right there, filed a cease and desist, gone to the police, but no. I wanted to see just how far she would take it. Because the deeper she dug, the harder she'd fall. And oh, she had no idea just how deep this hole was going to get. Badges, lies, and the wrong house to visit. It was a Friday morning, the kind where the air feels heavy before a storm, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet. I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, expecting the usual calm start to my day. Instead, I found two men standing in my driveway. They were dressed in mismatched uniforms, dark cargo pants, light blue shirts with embroidered patches that looked like they'd been bought online, and shiny plastic badges clipped to their belts. One was tall and wiry, his hair slicked back, eyes darting around like he was rehearsing a script in his head. The other was shorter, bulkier, with a thick neck and the kind of cheap aviator sunglasses you'd see in a gas station display rack. They didn't smile. They didn't wave. They just stood there, shoulders squared, clipboards in hand, projecting the kind of authority they clearly wished they actually had. I took one slow sip of coffee and let the silence stretch, making them uncomfortable before I spoke. "Can I help you?" I asked, my tone even but firm. The tall one cleared his throat. "Are you the homeowner?" I folded my arms. "Who's asking?" The shorter one stepped forward just enough to make it look like he was in charge. "We're with the Homeowners Association Enforcement Division. We're here to discuss your outstanding violations." I almost laughed right there. Homeowners Association Enforcement Division was not a real thing, not anywhere in the United States. It sounded like the name of a knockoff cop show. But they weren't joking. The tall guy tightened his grip on his clipboard, scanning it like he was about to read me my rights. The short one kept talking. "We have an active warrant for your arrest." That's when I decided to have a little fun. I raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." The tall guy nodded solemnly. "Per HOA code violations, you've repeatedly failed to comply with community regulations and have outstanding fines. We're here to bring you in." I let that hang in the air for a moment, as if I were processing the gravity of the situation. Then I smiled faintly and leaned against the porch railing. "All right, let's see it." The shorter man tilted his head. "See what?" "The warrant," I said plainly. "Not the notice you taped to my door last week, the real one. Signed by a judge." The tall guy hesitated. "Well, the HOA board issued it." "Oh," I said slowly, drawing out the syllable like I was savoring it. "The HOA board issued an arrest warrant. And does the HOA board have legal authority to issue arrests?" They glanced at each other. Neither spoke. The silence between them said more than they realized. It said they weren't prepared for pushback. They had expected someone to fold the second they mentioned the word warrant. I let them squirm for a few seconds longer. Then I sighed, reached into my back pocket, and pulled out my badge. Not a plastic toy, not a fake badge from a costume store. A real, federally issued U.S. Marshal's badge, polished, heavy, and unmistakable. I held it up between my fingers and let it catch the morning light. Their expressions changed instantly. The tall guy's mouth went slack, his clipboard dipping toward the ground. The short one actually took a step back, his bravado draining faster than water through a sieve. "You two just attempted to detain a federal officer," I said evenly. My voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "That's a federal crime. Impersonating law enforcement is another one. And since you brought this nonsense to my doorstep, I now have reason to believe you're acting under the direction of someone committing fraud." The tall man stammered, We were just told." "I'm sure you were," I cut in. "But here's how this works. I have 2 questions for you. First, where exactly is your authorization to conduct arrests? Second, would you like to be charged before or after I run your names through the federal database?" That was all it took. The tall guy's clipboard clattered to the driveway as he took a shaky step backward. The short one muttered something under his breath and turned on his heel, heading back toward the street without another word. Within seconds, they were both moving fast, too fast to be called walking, but too slow to be called running, glancing over their shoulders like they expected me to be right behind them. I didn't chase them. I didn't need to. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching them vanish around the corner. The game had just changed. I went inside, set my coffee down, and opened my laptop. It took me less than an hour to run their names, using a combination of law enforcement resources and a few public records tools I trusted. They weren't real cops. They weren't even licensed security guards. They were part of a private security operation Karen had cobbled together, an unregistered, unregulated, completely bogus company with a flashy name and no legal standing whatsoever. Worse, this wasn't their first rodeo. I found half a dozen complaints from other homeowners who had been approached by the same enforcement officers over the past 6 months. The pattern was the same every time: fake citations, escalating threats, and finally a doorstep visit, designed to scare people into paying thousands in bogus fines. Some had paid. Some had fought back. But none had managed to expose the operation for what it really was. And now, I had something none of them had: the ability and the authority to take this all the way up the chain. But I didn't call it in. Not yet, because here's the thing. About people like Karen, they only stop when they're exposed in the most humiliating way possible. If I went straight to the authorities, she'd spin it, claim it was all a misunderstanding, throw the two fake cops under the bus, and keep her grip on the HOA. But if I could catch her in the act, if I could make her incriminate herself, then she wouldn't just lose her position. She'd lose everything. So I set a trap. I took her latest final notice, let her the one warning of pending legal action, and drafted a response. I kept it formal, polite, even a little shaky in tone. I asked for a hearing. I said I was willing to discuss terms. I made it look like she'd finally gotten to me, like I was on the verge of giving in. Karen took the bait faster than I expected. The very next day, I got an email not from any official legal body, but from the HOA's personal Gmail account, summoning me to an arbitration hearing. No location listed, just a date, a time, and the warning that failure to appear would result in further legal consequences. I stared at the email, then leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. She had no idea what was coming, because the U.S. Marshal in me wasn't just going to show up. I was going to bring the storm with me. The hearing that was never meant to be fair. The day before the so-called arbitration hearing, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by neatly organized files, my badge resting on top like a silent reminder of who I really was. I had been in plenty of dangerous situations before raiding safe houses, chasing armed fugitives, navigating tense negotiations where one wrong word could get someone killed, but this was different. This wasn't a high-stakes federal takedown. This was my own backyard, my own home, and my own name being dragged through the mud by a petty tyrant who thought a plastic badge and a few printed forms could bend people to her. Well, it wasn't about the fake fines anymore. It wasn't even about the bogus warrant or the ridiculous attempt to arrest me. This was about the fact that Karen had been running her little racket for months, possibly years, and no one had ever made her pay for it. I wasn't just going to shut her down. I was going to make sure she could never do this to anyone again. I reached for my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a trusted contact in the county sheriff's office, someone I had worked with on a joint task force years ago. I kept my voice casual but deliberate, laying out the situation, the fake officers, the fabricated charges, and the upcoming hearing. I didn't have to explain much before he agreed to quietly send a couple of plainclothes deputies to wait nearby during the meeting. The second call was to a federal colleague who specialized in white-collar crime. I had a hunch Karen's HOA Enforcement wasn't the only shady thing going on in her books. I didn't give him names yet, I just asked him to be ready. He knew me well enough to say yes without pressing for details. By the time I hung up, my plan was set. Tomorrow's hearing would be nothing like what Karen imagined. She thought she'd have the upper hand, that she'd corner me into admitting fault or agreeing to pay her invented fines. Instead, she was walking into a situation where every word, every action, every slip of the tongue would be documented, recorded, and ready to be used against her. The morning of the hearing, the air was thick and humid, the kind of weather where the sky seems to press down on you. I dressed in plain clothes, no uniform, no badge in sight, but I clipped a small, high-definition body camera to my shirt button, the kind that was nearly invisible to the untrained eye. My phone, resting in my jacket pocket, was already set to record audio and location data. I wasn't just attending this meeting. I was building a case. The email Karen had sent me gave nothing away about the location, only instructing me to meet at the HOA conference facility at 10 a.m. I knew Oak Ridge Estates had no official facility, so whatever she was referring to would either be a rented space or one of her cronies' offices. When I pulled up to the address, she texted me later that morning. It turned out to be the back room of a small strip mall accounting office. The blinds were drawn. A folding table and 3 mismatched chairs had been set up in the center of the room, with 2 stacks of papers neatly arranged in front of the middle chair. Karen's throne for the day. She was already there when I walked in, wearing a tailored navy suit and a smug expression that told me she thought she had already won. On either side of her sat 2 men, the same fake officers from my driveway, now wearing slightly better shirts, but still radiating the same cheap intimidation. Their clipboards were back, along with their plastic badges. The performance was about to begin. Kareem looked up and smiled like a cat who had cornered a mouse. "Ah, Mr. Dalton, thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." I sat without a word, my eyes scanning the table. One stack of papers was labeled evidence file, the other payment agreement. She didn't even bother to hide her agenda. She folded her hands and leaned forward. "We're here today to address your repeated violations of the Oak Ridge Estates Community Code. You've been given ample opportunity to comply, but unfortunately, your refusal to cooperate has left us no choice but to escalate this matter." I kept my face neutral, my voice calm. "I'm here to listen." Karen slid the evidence file toward me. "Inside, you'll find detailed records of your violations: failure to maintain property aesthetics, unauthorized modifications, excessive noise, refusal to submit landscaping plans. We have photographic evidence and witness statements from multiple residents." I flipped open the file. The photos were laughable, blurry shots of my yard, my driveway, even my mailbox, all taken from odd angles that made perfectly normal things look suspicious. The so-called witness statements were typed, unsigned paragraphs full of vague accusations like, "I often hear loud noises from his property at night, and he seems hostile toward the community." I looked up. None of this proves anything. Karen's smile didn't falter. "Perhaps. But combined with your outstanding fines now totaling $2,300, we believe the board has sufficient grounds to recommend immediate enforcement action." The shorter fake officer leaned forward. "Which means, sir, that we can and will proceed with arrest if necessary." I let the silence hang for a moment, then placed the file back on the table. "And you believe you have the legal authority to do that?" Karen's tone sharpened just a fraction. "Under Oak Ridge Estates regulations, the board is not a law enforcement agency." I cut in, my voice firm but measured. "And you are not officers. You are private citizens impersonating authority figures, acting under the direction of someone committing fraud." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably. The shorter one frowned but said nothing. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing us of a crime, Mr. Dalton?" I met her gaze without blinking. "No, I'm stating a fact." She laughed a brittle, humorless sound and leaned back in her chair. "You seem to think you're untouchable. That's a dangerous assumption." I reached into my jacket pocket and placed my U.S. Marshal badge on the table, letting it rest in the center like a palm. Silent bomb. The air in the room shifted instantly. The taller officer's eyes widened. The shorter one muttered a curse under his breath. Karen froze, her mouth half open. "I'm not untouchable, Karen," I said evenly. "But I am exactly the wrong person to try and intimidate with fake fines, fake warrants, and fake cops. This meeting is being recorded. Every word you've said today is evidence. And right now, there are law enforcement officers waiting outside who would be very interested in having a conversation with you." Karen's complexion drained several shades paler. She tried to recover, fumbling for her practiced tone. "This is all a misunderstanding." "No," I said, leaning forward. "This is a pattern. You've been running this scam on homeowners for months, maybe years, and after today, it's over." I stood, pocketed my badge, and walked to the door. Behind me, chairs scraped against the floor as the 2 fake officers half rose, uncertain whether to follow or flee. Outside, The two plainclothes deputies I had called the day before were waiting. Their eyes flicked from me to the doorway, ready to move the moment Karen stepped out. As I walked toward my truck, I could already feel the tide turning. Karen's empire of intimidation had just been cracked open, and it was only a matter of time before the whole rotten structure came crashing down. What she didn't know yet was that this wasn't the end of the fight. This was only the first blow. The fall of the HOA queen. When I got back home from that hearing, I didn't immediately make any calls. I didn't rush to the sheriff's office or the courthouse. I sat in my study, the blinds half drawn, and I reviewed the footage from my body camera. Every second of that meeting played out on my screen. Karen's smug smile, her scripted accusations, the nervous shifting of her two fake officers, and the moment her mask cracked when she saw my badge. It was all there, clear, undeniable. A perfect record of her arrogance turning into panic in real time. The thing about evidence is that it's only as strong as the context you wrap it in. I knew if I presented this to the right people without the full story, she could spin it, claim she'd been misled by the enforcement officers, insist the fines were legitimate misunderstandings, or try to hide behind some obscure HOA bylaw. That wasn't going to happen. I wasn't just aiming for a slap on the wrist. I wanted this to be so airtight that not even the most expensive lawyer could wriggle her free. So I began building the case piece by piece. I compiled every letter she'd sent me, every fake fine, every threat disguised as community outreach. I pulled public property records to confirm what I already suspected, that she had a pattern of targeting homeowners just outside the HOA's actual jurisdiction, hitting them with fabricated violations, then trying to seize property under the guise of unpaid dues. I cross-referenced that with court filings and found something even uglier. A string of fast-track judgments approved by the same local magistrate, always in the HOA's favor, always with little to no evidence presented. That was the crack in her foundation. If those rulings were invalid, every foreclosure she'd pushed through could be challenged. That meant lawsuits. That meant restitution. And that meant the end of her power. By late afternoon, I had enough to make my first move. I sent the body cam footage, the letters, and my compiled research to my contact in the county sheriff's office. His response came within minutes. "We've been waiting for something like this." He told me there had been whispers for years about the Oak Ridge HOA's heavy-handed tactics, but no one had been able to get hard proof. Now we had it. The next day, two unmarked vehicles rolled into Oak Ridge Estates. Plainclothes deputies visited several homes, knocking on doors quietly, asking questions, and collecting statements. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to start buzzing. People who had once avoided my gaze in the grocery store now stopped me to talk. Some told me about fines they'd paid out of fear. Others about inspections, where strangers had walked their property without permission. A few admitted they'd believed Karen's rumors about me until now. The more stories I heard, the more I realized how deep her scheme ran. She didn't just go after people who resisted her authority. She went after anyone who could be exploited. The elderly couple who couldn't afford legal fees. The single mother who worked 2 jobs and didn't have time to fight back. The new homeowners who didn't know the boundaries of the HOA and assumed she was legitimate. She had built her little empire on intimidation, deception, and the assumption that nobody would stand up to her, but now they were standing. I started connecting the residents to each other. If Karen had one advantage, it was isolation making. Each homeowner believed they were the only one facing her wrath. I broke that pattern. Soon there was a small but determined group sharing documents, comparing fines, and realizing the language in their notices was identical, right down to the TYPOS. While the residents were organizing, the deputies were working. On the enforcement side, they dug into the fake security company Karen had been using, finding that it wasn't registered in any state database and had no business license. The so-called officers had criminal records, petty theft, fraud. Even one conviction for impersonating a police officer years earlier. When confronted, they folded faster than a cheap lawn chair. They claimed Karen had promised them easy money for delivering fines and scaring some stubborn folks straight. It was a confession wrapped in desperation. Still, Karen didn't back down. If anything, she doubled down. That week, glossy flyers appeared in every mailbox in Oak Ridge Estates, warning residents about malicious elements attempting to undermine community integrity. She framed herself as the victim, accusing outside agitators, meaning me, of spreading lies to destabilize the neighborhood. The language was carefully chosen, but the implication was clear. She wanted to turn the community against me before the law could catch up to her. It didn't work. Her problem was that fear had already started to break. People who had been silent for years were now speaking up. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now came to my porch with stacks of paperwork and stories that made my blood boil. A retired veteran showed me photos of his garden, once flourishing, now destroyed after Karen's inspectors trespassed and tore up plants they claimed were in violation. A widow revealed she had been paying emergency assessment fees every year for supposed repairs to common areas that didn't even exist. By the end of the week, I had enough to bring in my federal contact. We met in a quiet diner 2 towns over, the kind with sticky menus and coffee that's been brewing since sunrise. I slid a thick folder across the table and began walking him through the timeline, the letters, the fake fines, the false arrests, the judicial connection, and now the growing stack of witness statements. He listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with each page. When I finished, he closed the folder and said, "We can work with this." That's when I knew Karen's time was up. The plan was straightforward but thorough. The sheriff's office would handle the immediate criminal charges: impersonation, harassment, trespassing, and attempted fraud. The federal team would dig into the financial side, looking for tax evasion, mail fraud, and any misuse of funds collected under the HOA. With both moving in parallel, she wouldn't have room to maneuver. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't go quietly. People like her never do. She'd fight, deny, and spin until the very last second. But I also knew something she didn't. The next time she tried to intimidate someone, it wouldn't be a frightened homeowner sitting across from her. It would be an investigator with a recorder running and a warrant in his back pocket. And when that happened, there wouldn't be any more community hearings or enforcement visits. There would be real handcuffs, a real booking photo, and a real trial. Her kingdom was crumbling, and I was going to make sure the final collapse was loud enough for every HOA tyrant in the state to hear. The takedown. The day of the takedown started long before the sun even considered rising. The street outside my house was silent, the kind of heavy silence that only comes just before something big happens. I was up at 4:30 a.m., not because I needed to be. My role in this part was mostly observation, but because years of law enforcement work had hardwired me to wake early when there was an operation in play. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at my dining table, the only light in the house coming from the small lamp beside me, its glow spreading across the stacks of files I'd spent weeks compiling. Everything we needed was in those papers: the letters, the forged fines, the body cam footage from the hearing, the statements from residents, and the damning confession from her so-called enforcement officers. By the time I stepped outside, 2 unmarked SUVs were already parked at the corner. Inside were my federal contact and 3 deputies from the county sheriff's office, all dressed in plain tactical gear. There was no SWAT-style display. No need for flashing lights or battering rams. This was going to be clean, efficient, and by the book. The goal wasn't just to arrest Karen. It was to make sure the arrest was rock solid in court. We moved in quietly. Karen's house sat at the end of a curved cul-de-sac, its immaculate lawn and pristine hedges a sharp contrast to the rot hidden beneath her leadership. The porch light was still on, casting an amber glow over the front steps. As we approached, the deputies split off, positioning themselves to cover the exits. My federal contact and I walked up the path, the gravel crunching softly under our boots. He knocked firmly, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the early morning stillness. It took less than a minute for the door to swing open. Karen stood there, in a silk robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, eyes still heavy with sleep. For a fraction of a second, she looked confused. Then she saw the badges, and the color drained from her face. "Karen Whitmore?" My contact said, his voice calm. "And professional, yes." She replied, her tone cautious. "You're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud, impersonation of a law enforcement officer, harassment, and conspiracy to commit extortion. You have the right to remain silent." "That's absurd." She snapped, her voice rising. "This is a misunderstanding. I am the president of the Oak Ridge HOA, and she didn't get to finish." The deputy stepped forward, and before she could retreat, they had her turned, cuffed, and secured. She was still shouting, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate mix of outrage and denial. But her voice sounded different now, thinner, shakier. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their lawns, arms crossed, watching the woman who had ruled over them for years, now being led to a waiting vehicle in handcuffs. Others whispered to each other, the shock on their faces giving way to something else. Satisfaction. One older gentleman, a retired vet who'd told me about Karen's inspectors tearing up his garden, caught my eye from across the street. He didn't speak, but he gave me a single slow nod. It was enough. Karen was placed in the back of the SUV, still protesting, though now her words had shifted from anger to pleading. She claimed she'd been misled, that she had no idea the officers weren't real, that any errors were purely administrative. But no one in that driveway believed her, least of all the investigators, who had spent the past 2 weeks piecing together the financial paper trail she'd left behind. Because the truth was, Karen hadn't just been collecting bogus fines. She had been funneling portions of that money into personal accounts, disguising it as maintenance reserves and special assessment fees. The HOA's actual operating fund was modest, but the hidden transfers told a different story. Luxury vacations, expensive clothing, high-end jewelry. She'd built her image of authority on the backs of the very people she claimed to serve, and now the receipts were going to speak louder than any defense she could try to spin as the convoy of vehicles pulled away. The neighborhood seemed to exhale for the first time in years. I stayed a little longer, talking quietly with a few residents who came over to thank me. Some of them were still processing what had just happened. Others were already planning their next steps, electing a new HOA board, revising the bylaws, and making sure no one could ever consolidate that much unchecked power again. But not everyone was relieved. I caught sight of a few of Karen's loyalists, the ones who had benefited from her favoritism, who had been spared fines or granted special allowances in exchange for their silence. They stood apart from the rest, glaring at me as if I had personally dismantled their safety net. Maybe I had. But their glares didn't bother me. If anything, they reminded me that cleaning up a mess like this is never the end of the story. It's just the start of rebuilding something better. Later that afternoon, the news broke county-wide. A local reporter I trusted released a detailed article outlining the charges against Karen, the scope of her scheme, and the testimonials from the victims. The story spread fast, not just because it was juicy local gossip, but because it struck a chord with anyone who had ever been bullied by a power-hungry HOA. My phone lit up with messages from strangers thanking me for standing up, sharing their own horror stories, and asking how they could push back in their neighborhoods. As for Karen, she was booked into county jail pending arraignment, her mugshot already circulating online. The woman who had once stood in my driveway like a queen surveying her land now stared out from that photo with eyes that had lost all trace of control. The smugness was gone. The power was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Oak Ridge Estates felt like it belonged to its residents again. But I knew there was still one more chapter to write, the court case. Karen was going to fight, not because she had a chance of winning, but because her pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. And when that day came, I would be ready to take the stand, evidence in hand, and watch her empire collapse for good. The verdict: the courthouse in our county wasn't a grand marble structure like you'd see in big cities. It was practical and unassuming. A 2-story brick building with a metal roof and a single flagpole swaying out front. But on the morning of Karen Whitmore's trial, it might as well have been the center of the universe. The parking lot was already filling when I arrived, and clusters of Oak Ridge Estates residents stood in small groups, their voices low but charged with anticipation. Some had come out of solidarity, others out of pure curiosity. Either way, the air was thick with the knowledge that this was the day everything would finally come to light. Inside, the courtroom was almost full. I took my seat near the front, my folder of documents resting on the bench beside me. Across the aisle, Karen sat with her attorney, a tall, sharp-suited man with slicked-back hair and the kind of cold eyes that suggested he'd defend a burning building if the money was right. Karen herself looked different from the woman I'd first encountered in my driveway. Gone was the commanding posture, the confident smirk. She wore a muted gray suit, her hair pulled back, and her hands twisted together in her lap. But I'd learned long ago that appearances in court were just another costume. I wasn't fooled. When the judge entered, the room hushed. This wasn't the same magistrate who had rubber-stamped her FRA rulings. That man was already facing his own investigation. This judge was known for being methodical, for cutting through theatrics to get to the truth. After the formalities, the prosecution opened with a statement that laid it all out in clean, deliberate language: the false fines, the fabricated warrants, the impersonation of law enforcement, the financial records showing misappropriation of HOA funds. They didn't have to embellish. The facts were damning enough on their own. When it was my turn to take the stand, I kept my answers clear and direct. The prosecutor walked me through the sequence of events. The first letter, the escalating harassment, the morning the fake officers showed up, and finally the so-called hearing where I revealed my badge and confronted Karen. I described the intimidation tactics she used on the community, the residents who had been too afraid to speak out, and the paper trail that proved her actions weren't mistakes. They were calculated. Her attorney tried to rattle me during cross-examination, suggesting that I had a personal vendetta against her, that I'd exaggerated my claims to make her look bad. I didn't rise to the bait. I simply leaned forward and said, if telling the truth makes her look bad, that's because the truth is bad. That drew a few quiet murmurs from the gallery, and even the judge's gavel couldn't fully smother them. The most powerful moment came when several residents testified. The retired veteran, the widow, the single mother, each told their story, their voices trembling but steady enough to carry across the room. You could see the jury leaning in, their faces hardening with every new account of Karen's abuse of power. And Karen, she stared at the table in front of her, her pen tapping against the legal pad like she was trying to tune them out. After 3 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. Those hours felt longer than the entire investigation. When they finally returned, the room went silent. The foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: fraud, impersonation of a law enforcement officer, harassment, conspiracy to commit extortion, and multiple counts of financial misconduct. Karen's head dropped. For the first time since this began, she didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't even look up. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later, and when that day came, the punishment was decisive. 5 years in state prison, restitution to every homeowner she had defrauded. and a permanent ban from holding any position in an HOA or similar organization. When the gavel fell for the last time, the collective exhale in that room was almost palpable. People hugged each other. Some cried. A few shook my hand, thanking me over and over, though I told them the truth, it wasn't just me. It was every single person who had stepped forward, every neighbor who had finally decided enough was enough. In the weeks that followed, Oak Ridge estates began to look different. The new HOA board, chosen by actual democratic vote, started dismantling the oppressive policies Karen had put in place. Fines were reviewed and in many cases erased. Residents who had lost property to her scheme were given legal assistance to challenge the seizures. The fear that had once hung over the neighborhood was gone, replaced by cautious optimism. One evening, as I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, the retired veteran walked by. He stopped at the edge of my driveway, looking out at the street, where so much of this had unfolded. "Feels quieter now," he said. "Quieter's good," I replied. He nodded. "Quieter's real good." Then he kept walking, his hands in his pockets, the weight he'd carried for years finally starting to lift. As for me, I didn't stick around to bask in any hero narrative. Life as a U.S. Marshal means moving forward, always ready for the next challenge. But Oak Ridge Estates had taught me something important, that sometimes the worst battles aren't fought in dark alleys or faraway cities. Sometimes they happen right on your doorstep, against people who think their little patch of authority makes them untouchable. And when they're wrong, when they've been using that power to crush others, there's no better feeling than being the one to take it all away. Karen learned that the hard way. And I have a feeling the story of her downfall will be told around here for a long, long time.